I'm Shelby. I'm the editor-in-chief and co-founder of DoubleBlind.
And I'm Madison Margolin, also co-founder and managing editor of DoubleBlind. So Psychedelics 101 with co-founders Shelby and Madison. We're in what's called, or what people are often calling, the Psychedelic Renaissance, right? And I just want to preface that with, while this is sort of a renaissance, at least to the world of Western science and medicine, psychedelics have been used in indigenous traditions since basically the beginning of time. And there are cultures that have deep wisdom and ritual around psychedelic practices with plant medicine and fungi that we can look to, not necessarily in an appropriative way, but just in a way that allows us to better understand the sacredness of these medicines and how a culture can actually really develop around them and around the concept of healing and spirituality. So psychedelics as we know them today in the Western world became popular around the mid-20th century. MDMA was actually developed by a German pharmaceutical company, Merck, as an appetite suppressant for soldiers around World War I. And LSD was, as many of you probably know, accidentally discovered by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938. A couple of years later, he realized you could trip on it. And it was used by the CIA as a truth serum and sort of had a very sort of non-psychedelic use, specifically by the government. In the 50s and 60s, academics like the mycologist R. Gordon Wasson, who sat in ceremony with Maria Sabina, Aldous Huxley, the writer, Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ram Dass, who were at Harvard, all discovered the wonders of psychedelics in a way that wasn't initially stigmatized, but rather a wonder in the world of psychology and academia. When the studies specifically at Harvard went too far, psychedelics, along with cannabis, became seen as a symbol of the counterculture and the anti-war movement. Nixon launched the war on drugs in 1971, basically banning all the psychedelics we know of, except at that point, MDMA was not yet banned. And we kind of entered the Nixon and then Reagan era of the drug war, which we're all familiar with. And many of you, I'm sure, have gone through the DARE program and so forth. So I just want to make a note, MDMA, about its history, was actually repopularized in the 70s by chemist Alexander Shulgin and was used as a tool in couples therapy and made its way sort of into the rave scene and the dance floor, and then also became banned as it became more popular in popular culture. Now here we are into like the final phase of the quote unquote Renaissance. MAPS, the Multi-Disciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, was founded in 1986, and in the early to mid 90s, DMT researcher Rick Strassman was actually one of the first researchers to get FDA approval and DEA approval to study DMT out of a study in New Mexico. And since then, things have been slowly opening up. You may have heard about the psychedelic research coming out of Johns Hopkins, specifically looking at psilocybin. That was started more than a decade ago at this point, and now there are all other institutions like NYU or USONA, which is based out of Europe, that are also studying psilocybin, and they're looking at it, psilocybin being the main component in magic mushrooms, and they're looking at it for end of life distress, eating disorders, addiction, anxiety, mysticism, etc. And we're also beginning to see studies right now on LSD or ayahuasca or anything else, kind of looking at, again, microdosing, grief, addiction, depression, anxiety, for a multitude of psychedelics. And one thing I want to note also is the parallel to the cannabis movement. So in terms of both psychedelics following the trajectory of cannabis in regard to being decriminalized at the local level, and the laws kind of changing around them from either through grassroots activists or through FDA approval of psychedelic studies, which Shelby's going to talk more about. Cannabis is also sort of just paving the way for psychedelics. A lot of people, once they start to accept cannabis as a mainstream medicine, might look to other plant medicines and entheogens or psychedelics also as legitimate forms of medicine and therapy tools.
And I just want to actually give a little note here, because I know there are so many things that we could talk about, and hopefully you guys find this interesting. If you don't, you can just put in the chat, "This is not interesting." But we just figured we would give you kind of an overview of all the various tidbits of what we cover. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on politically with psychedelics, a little bit about what's going on with the science, and then in the end, we're also going to cover the fundamentals of tripping and how to trip. So what's going on with the science? What is happening in the psychedelic movement within the last 3 years has been absolute bananas. The psychedelic industry is on steroids when it comes to drug development. Actually, just in the last few months, there's been more than $100 million that's been poured into the development of synthetic versions of psychedelics for a whole bunch of different conditions, like DMT for opioid use disorder, psilocybin, of course, for depression. I mean, you could go on and on. There's a synthetic derivative of ibogaine called 18-MC, which is being researched in Canada, again, for opioid use disorder. So there are tons and tons of basically psychedelic pharmaceutical companies, some of which are for-profit and some of which are non-profit, which are popping up in the space right now and basically looking to develop psychedelic medicines that they get on the market in the next 5 to 10 years for basically every kind of mental health condition you could ever possibly imagine. It's pretty crazy. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, I would say that one of the biggest things that's happened in the last 5 years is that Compass Pathways was founded, and Compass Pathways is a UK-based psychedelic pharmaceutical company that is behind most of the research that's really trying to push psilocybin onto the market for treatment-resistant depression. And Compass Pathways has raised millions and millions of dollars. Some of their main investors include big-time venture capitalists, including Peter Thiel and Michael Novogratz. So when Compass was founded, this was really the first time that a lot of people in the psychedelic community were like, whoa, psychedelics are they're actually really on the path to, being legalized and becoming sort of a medical industry in the soon-to-be future. Something else that happened in 2017, MDMA got breakthrough therapy status for post-traumatic stress disorder. The reason why, and then just shortly thereafter, psilocybin got breakthrough therapy status for treatment-resistant depression and for major depressive disorder. The reason why this is really important is breakthrough therapy status is essentially a designation that the Food and Drug Administration gives to a drug when they see that it has so much potential to treat something that nothing on the market is really working for right now. So there's more than 100 million people around the globe that have treatment-resistant depression, meaning, that they've tried all the things on the market and nothing's worked for them. Psilocybin, which is actually synthetic psilocybin, it's not the whole mushroom, is going to be legal likely within the next 5 years in a clinical context. 2018, we saw the very first double-blind randomized clinical trial investigating ayahuasca. There's actually, to this day, only been one small rigorous trial. It's this one out of Brazil looking at ayahuasca. And it found that after just one session of ayahuasca, that people treatment-resistant depression, the majority of them saw their symptoms significantly improve. But again, it was less than 20 patients. So there's a lot more that needs to be done in that realm. There's a whole bunch of reasons why ayahuasca is very complicated to study, one of which it's very hard to standardize dosing and recipe and whatnot, which we could get into more later if you guys are interested. 2019, Spravato became the first sort of psychedelic medicine to be approved by the FDA. It's a ketamine nasal spray, which was developed by a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson called Janssen. And this ketamine nasal spray actually can be legally administered in approved facilities under the guise of a healthcare practitioner. And actually just this past week, Spravato was also approved for major depressive disorder as well. So if you're interested in ketamine for treatment-resistant depression or major depressive disorder, you might actually qualify to get this covered by your insurance. 2019, Johns Hopkins opened a $17 million research center, which is amazing. Also last year, MAPS received what's called expanded access from the FDA for MDMA therapy. Expanded access basically means that this drug is going to be available before it makes it all the way through the FDA approval process. So MDMA likely, like I said, will be legal for treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder in the next 5 years. But even before that happens, some people are going to qualify to take MDMA for their trauma with therapists legally. And that's something that you can learn more about on MAPS's website. And yeah, there was a report, as I mentioned, there's been so much capital pouring into the psychedelic space, and a report just came out in the last few months. The psychedelic drug market is projected to be worth $6.85 billion by 2027. So that is pretty crazy.